So, welcome, Kimberly. We greatly appreciate your leadership as always. As all things, we begin by acknowledging the original stewards of the various lands we're on. We also acknowledge all our ancestors. We acknowledge all those who toiled without compassion or compensation. We acknowledge all the elders and community stalwarts whose shoulders we stand on as we build, share, and learn together for our collective liberation and sovereignty. So, I'd love for you to introduce yourself to our listeners and viewers and tell us a bit about your remarkable work.
Yeah, so thank you for the opening acknowledgement. I really appreciate hearing that when we have those acknowledgements of the elders and the ancestors, because it's something that I really believe in is that we have to do everything we can to make our ancestors proud. I'll say as Sego Seguego, Kimberly Murray Yungat, Gahaga Neganasatake Wakwaho. I introduced myself as Kimberly Murray. I'm Mohawk of Kanehsatake, and I'm Wolf Clan. I am the independent special interlocutor for missing children in unmarked graves, and I have a 2-year mandate. I was appointed by the Minister of Justice for Canada to help communities that are doing the very sacred work of trying to locate the missing children in unmarked burials of the children that were taken to Indian residential schools and other institutions.
Incredible. Thank you so much. You recently published the reports that was scathing and remarkable in terms of how comprehensive it was. And even the materials you shared with me really just shine the lights. And sunlight's always the best disinfectant. I'd love for you to share with me a bit about the academic, not just the rigor, but the amounts of work that goes in to producing reports like this.
Yeah, I mean, it's we have a small but mighty team that has been working on our reports. But I think the most important thing about our reports and our summary reports of our gatherings and our interim report is ensuring that we capture the voices of the survivors and community members that are actually undertaking and doing this important work of trying to find the children. Our reports are written for communities and for Canadians. And I've been really hoping to not turn that into an academic exercise. It's really important. And the Truth and Reconciliation Commission wrote about this and spoke about this often. We really need to move Canadians from their head to their hearts. And so to do that, it's really important that we uncover and share the truths from survivors' voices and perspectives. And so we've tried to create a balance in those reports with the factual information, but also making sure people can see and hear and feel what communities are feeling and experiencing as survivors of the Indian residential schools.
Indeed. It's serious work, and these nameless children need to be honored and grieved for, and the intergenerational trauma that's obvious within this ecosystem. In some instances, is appalling. So I commend you on your leadership and your tenacity. In terms of barriers and challenges to your work, what are they, and how do you and your team work towards overcoming these barriers and challenges?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to talk about the barriers and challenges that communities are facing, which are the same barriers and challenges that my office faces in trying to support communities. In our interim report, we identified 12 common concerns that we've been hearing from communities across Turtle Island of the challenges they're facing. And I think it's not a surprise to most people, access to historical records from the churches and from the government is problematic. We have colonial laws that are getting in the way of communities being able to follow the truth and to receive the truth and access the truth. So that's serious barriers. We also have enormous barriers with access to land. So a lot of the grounds where the Indian residential schools were are privately owned lands now. And, we don't have legislation nationally to grant access to communities to be able to do these searches. And we have to rely on the goodwill of the landowners to provide that access. And then, I mean, there's the other big concern and challenge I think communities are facing is the issue of denialism. And I've written about that, spoken about it frequently, as have many leaders and community members and survivors. And it's just another form of violence against survivors to have to address the deniers out there, those people that say Indian residential schools were good things, that people who say there weren't kids that died there. You know, it's really important that we take on those deniers and that everybody help in that regard.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think it's a ridiculous burden to put on communities that are already vulnerable and distinct, and already dealing with intergenerational trauma, to have to combat these forces of denialism. So once again, I commend you for your work. In terms of the law, from my understanding, the Canadian government has a mandate to protect burial sites and cemeteries. Are there any members' bills or legislation coming up or being passed or worked on to ensure that future generations are protected, as well some healing can happen once things are put in place in terms of regulatory frameworks?
Yeah, I mean, the thing about the thing about Canada and Canadian law is that when it comes to cemeteries and burials, it's under the provincial territorial government's jurisdiction, and so we don't actually have a national law to protect the burial grounds of Indigenous people. What we have is various legislations, whether it's the Cemeteries Acts or the Burial Cremation Acts, Coroners Acts, Heritage Acts, that are all passed by provincial governments. And they were never created with what's happening in Canada right now around unmarked burials. They weren't created with the idea that we would have this issue of burials of children at Indian residential schools. And so we really need to think about how we can have a national legislation, and how that would fit in our constitutional division of powers. And we need to amend many of these provincial legislations to provide more teeth to them, and to also have more responsibility to engage with Indigenous communities, to recognize that this is ancestral land. We have our ancestors buried all over Turtle Island, and we need to protect those burial grounds.
Ashe, ashe. So in terms of the intersection between memory laws, civil remedies, and just the criminal code, how does that work? Because educating the public and knowledge mobilization, I think, is imperative, especially to advance this work.
Absolutely. And, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, when they issued their volume 4 on missing children in unmarked burials, really wanted to educate Canadians about the history and to raise consciousness about the fact that kids died there, that kids were murdered there, that kids are buried on these grounds. And so, it's really important that people read the TRC report and educate themselves. But, when I speak about denialism and we look at memory laws around the world, it's really important that we, as we're educating people, we also need to have some kind of legal tool to stop people that are trying to rewrite history, to stop people from inciting hate against survivors and communities that are doing this important sacred work. And we amended the criminal code in Canada to make it a crime to incite hate against the Holocaust, and to address the Holocaust denialism. So maybe that's something we need to do around Indian residential school denialism. But we can't do it on its own. We have to keep educating. And it's really concerning to me when we look at the provincial curriculums in schools. We have not got to the stage where the TRC made recommendations and calls to action on changing our curriculum. We had some good progress during the TRC days, but then with changes of government and changes of provincial leadership, we see a rollback of the mandatory curriculum on Indian residential schools, and it's almost trying to erase history again. So we really need to keep advocating for curriculum change in high schools, elementary schools. You're never too young to learn about Indian residential schools and the history of oppression against Indigenous people in Canada.
Absolutely. When you do your research on the reformatories, on these institutions, on the mental health spaces, on the it's atrocious and vile. And this is hard labor. So once again, I commend you on your work. So what is your ultimate goal and what does success look like to you and your colleagues?
Well, I guess I'm very committed to meeting the mandate timeline because the survivors deserve it, right? The survivors have been waiting for too long. The TRC issued a number of calls to action around missing children and unmarked burials that were not implemented over 8 years. When to Kamloops announced the 215 burials of children, none of the calls to action had been implemented by the provinces and territories and the federal government. So I think it's really important that there be no more delay, and I don't want to be part of any further delay in taking action. So success for us, we have successes every day as we do this work, finding family members, loved ones in unmarked graves in cemeteries, and locating records for families that live in the far north had no idea where their child was taken to. You talked about the reformatories and the other institutions. That's sort of the missing piece of the TRC report. We did not talk about the transfer to the extent that it existed of children between institutions. And as we do this work, we're now finding kids that were apprehended to Indian residential schools and then transferred to Indian hospitals, sanatoriums, reformatories, and dying in those institutions and being buried hundreds of miles away from their communities, and their families never told where they're buried. So, we have those successes every day when we find those loved ones and the family members are able to go to the cemeteries, do their ceremonies, exhume the body if that's what they want to do to bring the child back home. But long-term success would be that we have protection of these grounds, that we have tools for communities to say, wait a minute, you can't develop those lands because we believe that there's a burial on those grounds, and that the law gets triggered where we don't have to go to court to fight for injunctions to stop development, and that everyone comes together and puts a proper archaeological plan in place to search those grounds to make sure that we're not disturbing the ancestors.
Ashe. So in terms of the intersection and just the relationship between Black and Indigenous communities, I'm so grateful for the leadership of my brother Jeff Sear from Raven Capital, Wahi, Shadi from the National Association of Friendship Centers, and others. We've been working for a while now. Tiffany Callender from the Face Coalition, Liban, Craig Wellington. There's so many folks, Isaac Olawalafe, to build out this Beyond Solidarity table, a table where Black Indigenous leaders come together to find ways and means to consolidate our policy efforts, consolidate power. With that being said, in your work, have you identified, whether it be through ground penetrating radar or reports or jurisdictions, Black bodies, Black children, Black people that have literally been either murdered, buried inappropriately, or just unnamed, and remove the dignity of being acknowledged in your work across Canada?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. As we're looking at going to cemeteries, doing archival research, I absolutely have come across similarities of Black people, Black children being disrespected and in the same way that Indigenous children and Indigenous peoples have been disrespected in death. Unnamed Black people in cemetery grounds, no headstones, disparaging terminology used in death records. So there's absolutely, I think, a shared experience with Indigenous people and Black people in relation to the disrespect and indignity that was perpetrated by governments, municipal governments, provincial governments on death. And so, I think it's we see it we saw it in the United States as well around the Boot Hill Reformatory in Florida, and I think that more needs to be done in Canada to identify those cemeteries, those institutions where Black children and Black people may have been taken to, died at, killed at, and where are they buried. I think collaborating and working together, as you mentioned, is really important to share that information. We see a lot of the collaboration. We're trying to create this collaboration right now, even just between First Nations, because we have a lot of duplication of work happening, and we need to be able to share information. When one community finds death of children from another community, they need to be able to share that information together, work together on next steps. And I think that that's the type of collaboration we need to have with the Black community as well as we do this work and find information about Black children.
Absolutely. And are there any ways that people of African descent or Black folks can support your work? I know that there's a case going on at the Niagara on the Lake recently that I became aware of, but is there ways that we can contribute to your work?
Well, I mean, I think like everyone, it's really important that everyone educate themselves about what's happening. Everyone reads Volume 4 of the Truth and Reconciliation report to understand the extent of the deaths. And I think it's really important when we talk about the denialism that everybody speak up and try and put a stop to this, because communities that are grieving, doing the sacred work of finding the burials shouldn't be the ones that have to take on the deniers. That's a Canadian issue, and Canadians need to address that. It shouldn't be left to the survivors and Indigenous people. But I think most importantly is to educate ourselves, have an understanding of what's happening, and support through the advocacy. If we're going to be pushing for new legislative changes, policy changes, to stand together and support that. Talk to your MPPs, talk to your MPs, to your municipal government leadership, to say, like, what are you doing around the issue of unmarked graves of children?
Incredible. And that's a perfect segue to my last question. Do you have any closing thoughts or a call to action to Canadians?
I mean, I guess that is my call to action, I suppose, is to, don't just read the calls to action of the TRC, read the report, read my summary reports and hear the voices of the survivors from our gatherings, so you can see the challenges and hear the challenges of communities, what they're facing, and think upon yourself what you can do in your organizations, in your families, in your community, to help support that work. That is so important. My mandate's only a 2-year mandate. It ends June of 2024. This work of finding the children is going to take at least a decade, especially when we think about all the other institutions that need to be searched. I will put a plug. If you go to my website, we have a map that we did with Canadian Geographic, and you'll be able to see across Turtle Island where searches are happening right now. And unfortunately, that map, we keep adding more and more locations. It's interactive. You can click on the icon. You can read a little bit about the institution that is of the grounds that are being searched. You can see where anomalies have been located and where further archaeological work is happening. I encourage everyone to look at that map, share that map, speak to your children about that map, and just keep the conversation going and think about what you can do individually and professionally to support the work.
I so appreciate your leadership, tenacity, resilience, and stewardship of this remarkable work. You stand on the shoulders of mighty ancestors. Thank you, Kimberly. And we'll close the way we began this interview by acknowledging the original stewards of the various lands we are on. We acknowledge all our ancestors. We acknowledge all those who toiled without compassion or compensation. We acknowledge all the elders and community stalwarts whose shoulders we stand on as we build, share, and learn together for our collective liberation and sovereignty. Thank you so much, Kimberly.
Nawagoa. Thank you.